Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. It's my pleasure to be joining you this evening for a business awareness revision session. My name is Anne, and I'm going to be taking you through a task this evening from the business awareness paper. And it's going to be task number 7. And task number 7 looks at information requirements in a business. So we look at sort of the qualities of good information, the role of the finance function, as well as things like risk and risk management. So all of that sort of thing pops up in task number 7. That's going to be our plan for this evening. So we're going to be working from the business awareness revision question pack. I'm just going to open up that at task number 7 here. And also just wanted to mention, if you are joining for the first time, or this is the first recording perhaps that you are watching, just to say for each task, before we actually launch into the question, you'll see that we show you what sort of thing that task might cover in your live assessment. We also show you how many marks the task is worth, so what to expect in terms of mark allocation, and then how long that would actually allow you in terms of completing the task. So this one is just 12 marks, 11 minutes. No written sections within here. It's just a case of ticking some boxes. The next thing I wanted to point out to you is this task briefing. So before we launch into each task in our course materials, we do actually include a little bit of a briefing for you. And it's just like revision notes, I suppose, if you like, just gives you a bit of an idea, just a reminder of some of the key areas that are potentially covered within this task, so you can have a quick flick through before you actually start with the task itself. So feel free to use those task briefings for a little bit of revision if you feel that you need it at some point. Perhaps as we work our way through the task, it might highlight for you some areas that you do think that you need to put a bit more work in. So I'm not going to go through the whole task briefing, but I did think I might point out 1 or 2 things before we have a look at our task. It's quite a short task this evening, as you can see. Mark allocation in the exam is just 11 minutes. So I thought we'd have time to look through a few things in our task briefing first. So the first area really being about information requirements within a business. And you can see that our business is set out here as a pyramid. And the point of that really is I suppose to reflect perhaps the number of staff at each level. So at a strategic level, we have our senior managers, the people that are driving our organisation forward, the people that know our strategic vision. So they would be at the very top. Under them, there'd be a layer of what we might call tactical management, sort of dealing with maybe more medium-term thinking, more medium-term decision-making, where the strategic or the corporate level might be more focused on long-term planning, perhaps. And then we've maybe got medium-term planning here in the middle. And then at the operational level, a bit more sort of day-to-day or short-term decision-making and short-term planning. So we tend to have more staff at an operational level. They're overseen by supervisors or managers at the managerial level. And then on the top of that, sort of our board of directors, our chief executive, chief operating officer, and so on, at a sort of strategic level there. So each of these different categories of people are going to need different sorts of information. So let me just use an example of, let's say, a Costa Coffee. If we're thinking about Costa Coffee as an organisation, and I use that just because it's perhaps a name that we've all heard of. If I was thinking of operational managers, that might be the manager of a local branch. So I think about my local branch in Cambridge on Hills Road. And the sort of decisions I expect that person's going to have to make is, what am I going to do now? I've got a staff member going off on maternity leave. What am I going to do next week? I've got a staff member that needs time off for a family emergency. What am I going to do now because the delivery hasn't turned up? So these are sort of more day-to-day, week-by-week decisions that they have to make, and things that they need to respond to on a more short-term, day-to-day, getting on with the job type basis. So that might be an operational level manager. At the managerial level, or our tactical level managers, more medium term. So we might actually have a manager that oversees let's say the East Anglia region. So they're not only interested in just the Cambridge, Hills Road Costa, they're interested in all the costas within East Anglia. So maybe some sort of regional manager. And they might be advocating perhaps for maybe extra shops to be opened. They might be looking at maybe extending opening hours because it's Christmas. They might be comparing the results of one Costa Coffee on Hills Road with maybe one in the train station to see which one's doing better, which product lines are doing better in the area, and so on. What works well in some places and not in others? Why does one have better profits than the other? And making decisions as a result of that. Whereas on a more long-term strategic corporate viewpoint, Costa might be looking at how to finance the company. If they need to raise some more money, should they be selling some more shares? Should they be getting some more debt? Maybe they're looking at expanding into Europe. Maybe they're looking at closing down some shops. Maybe they're thinking about whether they ought to buy all their premises or just rent them. These are sort of bigger, longer term, more important, far-reaching decisions that tend to be made at a more strategic level. So that, I think, is quite a good little overview of the different 3 tiers that you have. There's also a little section I'm not going to run through, but it is there for your use. The qualities of good information, because each of these managers, as we've just discussed, needs information, but information has to be good information. So here are the qualities of good quality information, which you can learn with the mnemonic ACCURATE. So have a look at that if you're not already familiar with it. Big data, that's actually something we're going to revise through our task. So I think we can revise some of the terms as we get to the task. I think we'll come to that. And we then look at different types of risk and the management of those risks. So I thought we might just have a quick run through this as well. Now, risk is defined as the variation in outcome from what is expected. So if I'm expecting, let's say, the take-ins in my shop to be £2,000 for the day, the risk is a measure of how much they may deviate from that £2,000 that I'm expecting. Maybe they get as low as 1,800 and as high as 2,300. Maybe that's my range. So that will help me to understand the risk, the variability of the returns around an average, the variation in the outcome from what I was expecting. So really just looking at the chance of things turning out not quite as expected. That's what risk is. We can actually group our risks into different classifications, which is what we do here, dealing with both the level of the risk, strategic or operational. So remember on our diagram, strategic was sort of like bigger picture, these longer term decisions. Operational was a bit more day to day. So that might help us to understand the level of the risk as well as the type of risk. So strategic risk then, it says, is the risk that arises from the overall strategic positioning of the business in its environment. So thinking about whether a business chooses to sell primarily online or whether it chooses to have shops in the high street. That would be a strategic level risk. Thinking perhaps about whether we're actually in the correct industry, whether we're in an industry that's actually now fading away, that nobody's really interested in. So I suppose for Costa Coffee, I mean, they're primarily coffee shop, aren't they? Do they ought to be expanded into other things? Did they ought to specialize? Did they ought to have like niche products? Are they more mainstream? These are the sorts of strategic level risks that face them to make sure that they can compete well with other people in the same sort of business area. Maybe thinking about the positioning of their shops, whether their locations are right or not. That's all a strategic level risk. Whereas operational risk is far more day to day. So that could just be the risk perhaps of us not making good quality products in our shop. There could be health and safety concerns. There could be issues around cleanliness. There could be fraud or theft going on. These are day-to-day problems. Theft by staff members just not turning up for work, us being understaffed, accidents therefore happening, orders being taken incorrectly. These are operational risks. So again, the variability of returns as a result of how we do things in a day-to-day business. a day-to-day basis. Business risk is then more linked to the type of risk. So these first two, very much about the level of risk. So is it a big picture risk affecting sort of their organisation overall, or is it more localised on a store-by-store level? And then the type of risk. So a business risk is really defined as the exposure that our organisation or our company has, anything that might happen that might lower profits or lead the business to fail. So that can sometimes come as a result of the leadership of our organisation. The decisions that the management team have made might lead us towards business failure. Or it could be things in the external environment. So if we thought about Marks and Spencer's as an example, obviously they have a food division, they have a retail clothing division. What if they decided to close down their food division and focus purely on clothes? There's a risk in doing that. And that would be a business risk, because it would be a risk made in relation to how the business actually is trading in future. So that would be a decision that was made by management. Of course, during the COVID pandemic, lots of businesses suffered. So there's also a business risk associated with factors outside of the manager's control. All of those are business risks. So they might be made risk as a result of decisions by internal managers, but not necessarily. They can also be environmental. Contrasting that with a finance risk, which is really a risk that the business fails because of how it's funded. The funding that the business is likely to have will come from one of two places. It will come from their shareholders. We call that equity funding. Or it might come from loan providers. And we would call that debt. And the mix of funding that they get in terms of debt and equity, and the implications of that, the fact that debt, like a mortgage, for example, interest rates go up. Oh my goodness, how are we going to pay our mortgage now? Interest rates go up. How are we going to pay our bank loan back? The business can fail because it's not able to meet its finance obligations, but that risk is called financial risk. So I've just tried to cover off a little more on the sections that I know are not covered specifically within the task. Leading on from the different types of risk, we do actually then have a little section on strategies that the business can take to try to manage these risks. So these are summarised in the little table. You can transfer a risk, which means get insurance. You can avoid the risk by just not doing whatever it was you were thinking of doing. Accept it's a little risk. It happens. We're not really bothered. Or maybe reduce the risk by operating some standard operating procedures or doing things a little bit different to try to minimise the impact of things going wrong. So you do have ways to mitigate your risks. Once we understand the risks and we understand the seriousness of them, we can maybe apply that little matrix to decide what we're going to do about it. Okay, so that's just a little overview of the sorts of topics then that this chapter covers, or this particular question covers. Let's now have a look at this example. So here's a little example for us to have a look at. And the first one here is very, very interesting. Now this is for 4 marks. And as I read this first little section, well, let's not jump ahead, let's actually read the requirement here. It says, can we identify an appropriate strategy to deal with each of the following risks? So we've just chatted through risks. We're then given a list of 4 different risks. And for each one, we need to choose a strategy of transfer, accept, reduce, or avoid. There's nothing to say that we can't use each one more than once. So maybe I can accept all 4 of them. Maybe I can avoid all 4 of them. There's nothing to say I can't use one of my little boxes more than once. And I think here, with this first one particularly, it's a little bit vague. So I think I actually want to tick 2 boxes for this one. Now, I know that we can't do that in the exam, but I also know in the exam that the scenario that you're given would be a little bit clearer. This one is definitely a little bit, I think, leading me towards two different boxes. So let's have a read of it and see if you can select the two boxes that may be appropriate. I think we'd need a little bit more information to be able to select one box definitively for this one. So I'm going to go with two boxes. So it says, the business environment has a high risk of personal injury for the workforce, and therefore a risk of being sued. So what do we think? High risk of personal injury. Out of these four boxes, as a business owner, what might you do if there is a high risk of personal injury for your staff? Yep, good. So there's a suggestion we could reduce. There's a suggestion that we can transfer. Thank you, Elizabeth. I absolutely agree with the transfer. I would definitely go with transfer. And by transfer, we mean get insurance. So wherever there's a risk of some sort of injury, there's a risk of injury driving our car, to be fair, isn't there? Which is why we have car insurance. If we are in an accident, if we do injure another person, we have insurance against that. So if there's a high risk of personal injury, we can transfer the risk by getting insurance. The other one that I would have gone here, I would have said, if there is a high risk of personal injury for my workforce, did I ought to avoid the situation? Now, I'm not sure that I would be able to avoid it in its entirety. There are just some high risk jobs out there, aren't there? I think people that maybe work for the police, people in the fire service face risks every single day. We can't say, oh, it's too risky, let's not send the firemen into the fire. But sometimes we do. We say, actually, the building's not safe, nobody can go in now. So we transfer the risk as much as possible with insurance. And for the elements of risk that are just too risky, we then avoid the situation. So it could be a little mix of those, but you could also try to reduce the risk as well. I do think that this first bit here is definitely very much a discussion point, as opposed to there is a definitive answer for this one. So I do actually agree with Elizabeth as well. We could aim to reduce the risk a little bit as well, but I think my two overriding ones might be transfer it through the insurance, and when I consider the risk is just too high, maybe I then avoid it. If I had to pick one on balance, I was forced into one box or the other, I think I'd probably go with transfer, because there are jobs where there are just risks involved. It's just part of the job. We can't just not do our job. We've got to make sure that services are delivered. Think about the COVID pandemic, everybody working on the frontline NHS. We couldn't just say, oh, let's avoid the risk for our staff. Let's not send anybody to work. It didn't work like that. We just had to do our best to potentially reduce and then transfer the risk, as Elizabeth suggested. So definitely a bit of a discussion point, that one. The others, I think there are more obvious rights and wrongs. There still might be a discussion around them, but I think we might end up in one camp more than the other. So for the other three, I think I can pick one of the boxes. So for the first one, there is an opportunity to drill for oil in an area of outstanding natural beauty. There would be significant penalties if the extraction did not go as planned, and this would adversely affect the ability for the business to continue as a going concern. Does that look like a minor risk, or does that look quite serious? I'm sure you've come across the phrase going concern before now. If this opportunity is such that if I get it wrong, my entire business fails, there is going to adversely affect the ability for the business to actually keep going, I might say nothing is quite worth that. So I'm actually just going to avoid that opportunity because the risk is too high. I think that is really serious. So the fact that it's talking about the ability of the business to continue as a going concern, I'm definitely thinking there I would avoid that particular decision. You might say, is there a way that we could maybe again transfer the risk? If we had this as a little discussion point, yes, we could possibly transfer some of the risk if we could get insurance. Is there a way to reduce the risk? I don't know. We'd have to have more information, wouldn't we? But I think on balance with that one, I'd probably say stay away from it. If it's potentially going to bankrupt your business, maybe not such a good plan. Next one. A project is currently underway surrounding the credit control function, so collection of debts, etc. There are no major implications if the project were to overrun. What would I do? What might you go for there? It's a project around collecting of money. If I don't get it quite right and overrun a little bit, there aren't really any serious implications. Absolutely right. Yeah, we'll just accept that. Don't need to really do much about that, do we? There's no serious implications. We get it wrong. So what? Overruns by a few days. So what? It's not a life-changing situation, is it? So I think that one I can just accept. And then my last one, as a business, we're reliant on good quality materials. We've currently got 2 suppliers, but there are many numbers of alternative suppliers available. So I rely on good quality materials, and I'm using 2 suppliers, even though there's lots more available. There's a risk, isn't there? Can you see the risk that my suppliers might let me down? How could I mitigate against that risk? What can we do? Transfer, accept, reduce, avoid. What might we do here with this one? I think I'd reduce that one. How would we reduce it? Choose a few more suppliers. If you get a few more suppliers on board, then if one of your regular suppliers did let you down, then you would be in a good position to say, I've got others already lined up. I've tested the quality, I've already filled in the credit application form. I'm good to go. I'll just go with other options. Excellent. So just looking at this question again, had it told me to only use each box once, I'm absolutely certain with my answers for the last 2 there. Quite happy with those. Quite happy with the answer for my second one. I think if there is a decision that is going to adversely affect my business being able to continue altogether, then I'd probably go with avoid it, which would mean that I would opt on the side of transfer for the first one. Had the question said, make sure you only use each of the options once. So then I'd have transfer, avoid, accept, and reduce. I wanted to use the first one as a discussion point because I really feel that it could potentially have had one more than one answer there. Right, that was worth 4 marks. Next one is also 4 marks. And this is testing some of the characteristics of big data. And that's particularly why we didn't actually revise them in advance, because I knew that we could revise them here. So we've got 4 characteristics of big data: volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. We've got to remember what each of those mean, so I can then link them to each of these here. So the first one, see if we can get this one right. Big data comprises of data from many different sources in many different formats. Which characteristic best describes that sentence? Lots of sources, many different formats. Is that a description of volume? Is it velocity? Is it variety? Maybe veracity? Yes, Elizabeth, it is. It's variety, isn't it? Variety refers to exactly that. Variety is about the range of places that our data actually comes from. And in the modern age, it's not all just about, oh, well, we collect information with the customer when they fill in their personal details. They don't just collect our name and date of birth and address anymore, maybe our age. What they collect now is information about us through our social media activity, our browsing history, using cookies to see how we navigate around their website, sharing data between lots of different organizations to help build up a pattern of who we are, what we like looking at, so they can target their selling. So collecting data from many sources in many formats, could be photos that we've uploaded, it could be places that we've looked at on our sat nav. Somehow they get access to all of it to see what we are interested in, maybe if we're planning a holiday, so they can bombard us with holiday adverts. Big data is available at the touch of a button. Which one might describe that? Velocity. Yes, velocity is all about the speed with which now data can be collected and processed and made meaningful. So velocity about speed, definitely. So the fact that data is available so quickly, definitely velocity. Big data comes from structured and unstructured sources. Yeah, it does. So it can be our comments on Facebook, for example, or the things that we like on Facebook, the things that we follow, a little bit unstructured, or it can be very structured. It can be what demographic do we fall into, what's our annual salary. So it can be very structured or very unstructured. Some of which, though, the facts are questionable. That's the key here. The facts are questionable. Yeah, absolutely. That goes to veracity. Veracity is about the truthfulness. So it's great that we can now collect data from all these multiple sources, but how accurate is it? So that's what we've got to really think about when we decide whether we can really trust our data. Is it accurate or not? Or is it accurate at least for our purpose? So veracity determines the truthfulness of the data. And then the last one, big data is made up of numerous data sets. What do you think that one might be? Yeah, there's actually only one left, isn't there? And we did end up using one for each. So the fact that the data comes from lots of different data sets then is the volume. So yeah, data does come from lots of different places. There is lots of it. That's why it's called big data, because there's way too much for us to analyze in a little Excel spreadsheet these days. It's definitely needs some slightly more complex systems to help us analyze the volume of data that we're collecting all the time. Right, good. So that was worth 4 marks. Second part of part B, another 2 marks. Identify whether the following statements about big data are true or false. Big data will help us tailor our marketing strategy to individual consumer needs and wants. Do you find that you get tailored marketing? It's definitely true, isn't it? Yeah. So I've been looking at flights recently, so then I get lots of targeted emails at the moment. I get from Air France and Qatar and KLM. Every time I'm logging on, I'm getting adverts about flying to places because I'd been doing some Google search around flights. So yes, somebody's watching me, seeing what I'm browsing and making sure that the marketing that comes my way is tailored to my recent browsing history. Big data will help to improve the efficiency of the logistics of delivery to our customers. Could it do that? I'd say yes. In terms of the logistics of delivery to our customers, I think there's a couple of things there. It could mean the logistics as in planning our route, deciding which customer lives where, using traffic information to work out whether there's delays on a particular route at a particular time of day, trying to minimize having to go back to a particular area to deliver to sort of addresses that are close to each other. It could mean that in terms of the logistics of the actual delivery day, or it might just mean the logistics of the order arriving to the order being dispatched. Either way, having all this data that can be analysed to understand our customer needs better, to understand our organisation better, it should all help to improve our efficiency. All right, and then identify which 2 of the following might be a strategic risk. So remember what we said about strategic things? They tend to be like bigger things, top level organisation things. So we're looking for a strategic risk. I'm looking for 2. If I label these A, B, C, and D, have a think about which 2 you think are the bigger picture. Senior level management concerns. Yes, Alison, absolutely. And well done, Elizabeth, as well. Definitely B. Expand rapidly over the next 3 years, currently in a process of trying to access funding. That's not something that we do on an individual store by store level, is it? That's something that we do at a strategic level. Remember our finance risk, thinking about whether we get money from shareholders or do we get money from debt? What is it going to cost us? What if interest rates go up? What's going to happen then? All of that has to be considered. So that's a pretty big picture decision, especially the fact that it's over the next 3 years. It's like a long-term decision. What else did we go for? You chose C as well. Yep, I agree with that one too. The business is currently going through a period of product diversification. So we are looking at adding extra products into our range, struggling to ascertain the pricing strategy for the new product. Should we go in as a premium product, charging more than everybody else because our product is better quality or has extra features? Or should we go in with a cheaper price? Should we go in as a bargain basement, buy it because it's the cheapest on the market? Or maybe somewhere in the middle. That's quite a difficult place to be. But yes, definitely the pricing of a new product is going to be a strategic level decision. So let's see that we can definitely rule out the others. Unable to complete an order for a customer, this will be delayed by a week. That sounds a bit operational to me. Somebody's just got to phone the customer, explain the circumstances, maybe give them some gift vouchers if they're particularly unhappy, or try to make a plan to keep them happy. But definitely not something we want to be bothering our board of directors with. And D, staff issues at one of the sites. The staff are threatening to strike. I would say that this one is probably operational to start with. This one, definitely operational, but perhaps also a little bit, what did we call it? Managerial or tactical, I call it. So operational, because if the staff do strike and there's nobody at work tomorrow, that's a problem for the operational manager, but also managerial, like our middle level management, who might have to have dealings with the trade union, have to negotiate pay rises. And yeah, it might be a little bit more than just operational, might be a little bit more serious than that. So definitely the other two are my strategic ones, but we're now being able to rule out the others with an explanation. Okay. So there we go. So that was an example of a task number 7 for you. So I hope you find that useful. Do hang around now if you have any questions for me. I'm just going to stop the recording.